Don't worry about it. Yeah,
We'll hear him on Skype. Okay.
I hope.
Yeah.
We'll hear him on Skype. Okay.
I hope.
It's just loading. One sec.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on Facebook Live today. In the next half hour or so, I will be talking with Anthony Reed of Benchmark Politics and Tyler Pedigo. If you have any questions during the time, please comment on the Facebook Live thread. Thank you for joining us, Anthony and Tyler. Just to start out, Anthony, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Benchmark Politics?
Absolutely. So I'm basically a researcher at Louisiana State University. I'm getting my PhD in sociology. I've got about one more year left. I've got a heavy focus on quantitative methodology. I've done polls, I've done exit polls, I've done surveys and various research methods and stuff like that. And actually, so leading up to this election cycle, I've got a couple businesses based on prediction. So I predict student retention at universities, and actually have my own business on that. And I also predict prison recidivism, and I'm part of a really big research group that's going to be implementing the model that will predict basically whether or not somebody is likely to recommit a crime after being released from jail. And the goal behind that is actually going to be to release prisoners that are low risk from Louisiana's justice system, because we currently have the most incarcerated population in the world, in per capita, in Louisiana. This little plot of land is the most incarcerated. So using those methods, 2016 came along. I decided that, I like politics. I've always been involved in politics since I was young. And I decided to go ahead and try my hand at forecasting elections, and well, the rest is history. It's gone very well.
That sounds awesome. That's really interesting research that you're doing.
Thank you.
So, Tyler, could you tell us a little bit about your model and what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I came to DC here to go to graduate school, and I had a statistics background from undergrad. I took stats and econometrics back there, and I've always sort of enjoyed doing different statistical projects and trying to predict things. I've typically focused on politics, elections, and economics in the past. So what I've been doing in this election cycle is pretty much in line with the things that I've enjoyed doing in the past.
That sounds awesome. Sounds awesome. And could you go a little bit into the advantages of the specifics of your model and some of its advantages?
Now, I think that Facebook and Google data, I guess social media data more broadly, is really advantageous to conventional data sources like traditional polling, for a couple reasons actually. Firstly, because it's such a much larger sample size. Really, like when you're doing conventional polling, you have pollsters literally picking up phones, calling people, asking them which candidate they support. With the Facebook data that's came around this year, you're looking at the aggregation of the sentiments of millions of people, all at the same time. So the sample size is a big advantage. And secondly, you don't have to worry about any bias that's being introduced by the pollster in the way that they ask questions to these people. Now, not saying that every pollster does that, but it's just something you don't have to worry about. For instance, if I called you and said, do you know that Bernie Sanders' tax plan will raise your taxes by so many %, but then I ask you which candidate you support, that could introduce some bias into the line of questioning and influence results. Maybe not intentionally, but it could influence the results. So those are the two primary advantages of Facebook data that I think. Google data happens to be really good at measuring short-term sentiment.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of times elections sort of result, the fundamentals like demographic factors typically drive election results. But on occasion, a candidate can campaign so hard in a certain state that they really can move the needle in their favor, and Google data happens to be pretty good at tracking.
And that would capture those differences?
Yeah,
awesome.
It would capture differences in short-term sentiment.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And Anthony, could you go into a little bit about your model and some of the specifics of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So people that follow benchmark politics know that one of my sort of central phrases that I use a lot is demographics is destiny. It's And for me, it's basically looking at some things that occur at the demographic level. It's very just almost ingrained in terms of who certain groups are going to vote for, and then also merging that with polling data, which can kind of correct for some of the places where demographics is not the entire story. The biggest thing that I've done with my model, and what I really like about how it works, is looking at county level demographics, things that you don't really get from polling, which I agree with Tyler and a lot of his criticisms on polls. One of the #1 criticisms that I have with polls is that you can't get the breakdown at the county level. You're very much stuck with a state level prediction from a poll. Whereas whenever you use demographics at the county level, you can actually get a hold of groups, of population groups that can move the needle in terms of voting, but that might be underrepresented in polls. For instance, if a state is 5, 6, 7, even up to 10% black, a lot of times if you look in polls, the crosstabs will either not have crosstabs for that demographic, or the margin of error will be 8 to 10 points because it's such a small crosstab. However, whenever you have a demographic model, you're not going to be bound to that margin of error. You actually assign a value to that demographic and you adjust it based on polling. And so in our model, we basically found that at the county level, demographics made up about 75% of voting patterns, and polling made up about 25%. This is roughly speaking. And so basically using a demographic model, you can look at the demographics and then figure out where polls often miss. So you can find out that polls often miss Hispanic, Spanish-speaking Hispanics that may not have a very good grasp of the English language, for instance. That's one group of many, and using that all together, you can kind of aggregate and create fairly good state-level predictions.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And so where do you find most of your data? Is it all from one source, a collection of several sources, or is it pretty much dispersed?
Yeah, so I've got several data sources that I use, and actually looking back into all of the other prediction things that I've done, like college retention or prison recidivism, I've gotten a good handle on a lot of sources. IPUMS, which is basically a catalog of census data that you can look online. That's IPUMS. It's a fantastic data source. I get a lot of my county level demographic breakdowns from IPUMS. I also use Election Atlas, which has very good results for past elections at the county level and even at the city level. And lastly, I also use something called ARDA, which is the Association of Religious Data Archives. Okay. And this is really good for finding areas that are, say, highly Catholic, or areas that have high amounts of evangelicals, etc. And combining all three of those together with polling, I can usually get some pretty good results.
Awesome, awesome. That sounds really interesting. And Tyler, could you go into a little bit of the sources of your data, how they kind of come about with that?
Yeah, I use a lot of demographic data, just like Anthony does. Typically derived from the census website, or other legitimate sources. For the Facebook data, I really have Nate to thank for that, because his team is the one that posted all of that on their website. They were nice enough to do that. So I sort of took advantage of that, I guess. And the Google data, of course, comes from Google Trends. But other than those three sources, and maybe the FEC, that's typically the places that I get my data from. Okay,
sounds awesome. So, kind of changing focus now that we're wrapping up the primary cycle. Have you guys kind of noticed anything that you might want to change prior to the presidential election market? Tyler, I'll start with you.
Well, this sort of goes. Speaking about the general election, it's really difficult for me to apply the same methodology that I used in the primaries for the general election. I mean, with the primaries, I took a couple contests to actually get some data and to match the Facebook and Google data with results. That way, you can quantify the effects. But in the general election, with everybody voting at the same time, it's tough to apply the Facebook data or say even the Google data to that, because with the Facebook data, for instance. Anybody that's looked at the Facebook map on 538's website notices that Bernie has anywhere from 3 to 4 times more Facebook likes in pretty much, practically every state, but that doesn't mean that he's going to get 3 or 4 times more votes than Hillary. So you have a selection bias in the people that are going to be on Facebook, and that's what you had to correct for in the first couple contests. So as for the presidential election, to be honest, I'm still in the planning phase and trying to determine just how I'm going to approach that.
All right, sounds perfect. And Anthony, how about with your kind of shift towards the general election? Do you think there's going to be any major changes, or is it going to kind of stay consistent with the primaries?
So Tyler and I have discussed this in the past on Twitter before, and there has to be a shift. For the people that aren't statistically inclined, basically the way that this works is you have to build your model off something. You have to have a training data set is what we call it. And this means that, whenever you have a drawn-out primary process, it's really easy to gather a training data set. You can look at Iowa, you can look at New Hampshire. By the time you've got 3 states in, you have a dependent variable that is from this election. So it's beautiful. Predicting primaries is one of the easiest things to do, honestly, compared to predicting a general election. However, the general election does have some things that lend it to being a little bit easier. For instance, some areas are reliably Democrat, some areas are reliably Republican, whereas in the primaries, you don't have that. You have everybody is voting from the Democratic Party, and so there's no area that's reliably Clinton and reliably Sanders looking in the past. You have to sort of build that as you go. You don't really have to do that with the general election data set. And so my modeling strategy will change, but we're still going to use counties as our unit of analysis. We're still going to use demographics. We're still going to use polling. Our training data set is going to be based off of 2008 and 2012, but we're going to basically tackle the problem of not having a training data set this year by using polling crosstabs. So for instance, we can actually figure out from several polls in 2008 and 2012 which candidates received X amount of support from which demographic groups, and then retool that for 2016, plug in the new crosstabs, and proceed as planned.
All right, that sounds really interesting. And speaking of the general election, do you plan to make any predictions or apply your model to any of the House or Senate races?
This is one of the things that I'm extremely excited for. I am going to do a Senate model no matter what. I'd love to do a House model. I'm collecting data right now to see how feasible that is, because it is a little bit more difficult than doing primaries or doing even the general election. However, I don't see why some of these techniques couldn't be used. The only barrier is going to be a massive amount of data collection and purchasing, honestly. I'm going to have to purchase quite a bit of data from Election Atlas and other places. But right now, I'm planning on it. I've had a Kickstarter going and we're almost funded right now, so there's a likelihood that I'm going to be able to purchase some of these data sources and indeed release a House and Senate model. So yeah, absolutely. I would love to do it.
Okay, and just general question, throwing it out there, looking ahead. Do you think the Republicans are going to keep the Senate?
No, but I think that there's a high likelihood that they keep the House. I actually just released a tweet a little bit earlier today. There was a PPP poll that came out that is showing something that I think a lot of people have intuitively thought, and it's been discussed in the media a lot, but it hasn't really materialized until recently, whenever all of the Senate candidates are now deciding whether they're going to support but not endorse, or whether they're going to endorse, or whether they're going to completely just not endorse nor support. And what we've just found today was that Ayat in New Hampshire, her polling numbers have gone down a bit, and looking at the crosstabs, it would appear that a large reason for this is because independents are against the endorsement of Donald Trump in New Hampshire. I think that there's a likelihood that we're going to see that in other places, but there's the other fact of the matter is that there are simply more Republican seats up than there are Democrat seats. And so that will play, I think, a huge part in what's going to happen in the Senate. Now, for the House, the House, I think a lot of Democratic strategists will say that the House is too far gone and that it will take a few elections to bring that back to the Democratic Party. But I think that we've got a very strong shot at seeing a Democratic-controlled Senate this year.
Okay, awesome. And Tyler, what about your plans for Senate or House races? Do you plan to apply your model for that?
Well, it's problematic for the same reasons that I just discussed with the general election. With that being said, I would love to do something there. It just really depends on whether I have enough time to put something together for every Senate and House seat.
Okay, sounds awesome. And just general feelings, what do you think is going to happen with the Senate?
I'm broadly in agreement with Anthony here. I think that the Democrats have a good shot at the Senate, and I think everybody sort of agrees that the Democrats will make up some ground in both houses. But yeah, we'll see.
Okay, so kind of bringing it back to the presidential race, who do you think is probably the most likely vice presidential candidate, and for both parties? And do you think it's going to play a significant role in the election, whether it's going to kind of tip the scale?
I don't think that it's going to play much of a significant role.
Because of the strong personalities with each candidate?
Yeah, exactly. But at this point, I don't really know who the candidates, the vice presidential candidates will be in either side. I mean, everybody's got their own theories, and I've heard a lot of names being tossed around. I don't know. I don't purport to know.
Okay. Yeah. And Anthony, any speculation?
Oh, that's a good question. It's very hard for me, at least, to sort of take what I do and then go out on a limb on something like this, like, say, trying to figure out who the vice presidential candidate is going to be. So this would obviously be completely separate from modeling or polling. But, I think that right now Warren's name is being tossed around a lot. There's some questions as to whether or not they're going to go with the two-female ticket on the Democratic side. But she's certainly acting like somebody that's at least auditioning for the job. I think that there's a lot of support for the idea, especially among Sanders voters that have a lot of respect for Elizabeth Warren. On the Republican side, I know that I've heard Gingrich's name mentioned quite a few times. Among others, I think Sessions was another that's being talked about. And Chris Christie is the obvious early supporter of Donald Trump. As to whether or not these things are going to have an effect, one thing that I think is important to consider is that usually when a vice presidential candidate is chosen, the goal is going to be to appeal to people, and often you'll see a bump in polls after the vice presidential candidate is selected. So I'm going to be very much paying attention to how big that bump is and how quickly it may or may not decay. I'm looking at previous years where a vice presidential candidate was selected and what the decay curve was like. And so I think that your users would be very good to watch and see if that decay happens slowly. In other words, if the lead that occurs from it doesn't evaporate in a week, then that would say that it was a pretty good vice presidential selection. And that's what I'll be paying attention to.
Awesome, very good insight. And so, speaking of the DC primaries, which are tomorrow, do you have any particular predictions what's going to happen, or any kind of guesses at the margins?
I should be posting something later tonight, but
okay.
I think that it's going to be a complete blowout. I don't know. I've been looking at different outputs of my model, and some are giving massive margins to Hillary. So I'll make my final choice tonight with sort of what I think will happen.
Okay.
But at this time, I think that it'll probably be at least a 40-point margin.
Okay. Keep an eye on that. And Anthony, what are your thoughts on the election tomorrow?
Well, this is actually a place where I think Tyler's model does have an advantage on mine. There's absolutely no polling in Washington, D.C., and also, given recent events, there's a lot of things that are changing. The race has been called by the AP. Clinton had such a landslide victory last Tuesday. All of these things have occurred, and there's been no polling at all, and so my model would be a completely demographic model, whereas Tyler actually gets to have new input, new information from Facebook and Google Trends. With that being said, my model does say 6733 is currently what I've got plugged in, but we're not releasing that for a few reasons. Number one is that Washington, D.C. is a single county, and the way that our model works is that we aggregate counties upwards, and so we can't really do that with one county. And also with all of the events that have occurred recently, what we've built the model off of, the training data set, and all of the base assumptions for that don't really apply to DC because the race has been called and because so many things have occurred in the last few days. But I'm in full agreement with Tyler. Everything demographically alone says that this should be about a 40-point blowout. I've got it as about a 37-point blowout. So that's, I think there are some people right now that are actually, Nate Cohn recently posted, there are some people that are actually looking at the potential for non-viability in Washington, D.C., and that would obviously be a fairly big event if that occurred.
And so the predicted markets right now are showing that it's probably going to be a 50-point plus margin. Do you think that's an accurate estimate?
I think that that is, with all of the events that have occurred, that is certainly not outside of the realm of possibility. We looked at Maryland, and we've looked at Virginia, and even New Jersey, and these places sort of share some very similar demographic characteristics to DC. You have a large amount of minorities, but you also have a large amount of wealth. And whenever those two things sort of come together, Clinton tends to have her very, very best performances. For instance, Prince George County in Maryland, that was our highest prediction ever for any county. It was Prince George County in Maryland, and we had it at like 80-20 Clinton, and it turned out that that is indeed how Prince George County went, and that was because Prince George is both wealthy and has a high minority population. So yeah, I think that that is more than within the realm of possibility.
Okay. And what about yourself?
With the, like Anthony's saying, with the race effectively being over, with you know, the AP announcement and Sanders' big losses last week, it makes it like exceedingly difficult to try and put a number on DC for that reason, because I mean, what do you have to go off of? You know, I mean, Bernie's campaign has been sort of campaigning here in DC, but with all of his supporters basically realizing that he has no shot now whatsoever for the nomination, it presents the question, you know, will they show up to vote?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And do you think Bernie Sanders will drop out sometime soon, or is he going to take it to the convention like he says? I
mean, I guess he effectively sort of, I don't know. I mean, we've expected him to drop out for a little while now, and he doesn't. So maybe he really does have that much resolve. Maybe he really will take it all the way to the convention.
Okay, Anthony, what do you think on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think that some of the things that Sanders has said recently and some of the meetings that he's set up recently hint at the possibility that Sanders will be willing to, at the very least, join Clinton in a fight against Trump, as in not run as an independent, not play spoiler. I do think that he has a very large group of people that he has a lot of influence over, and there's a lot of people that definitely voted for him. And so I think that Obama, I think that Clinton, I think that a number of Democratic Party officials don't want him to drop out too quickly, because they don't want this to seem coerced. They want this to happen naturally. And so if it does take Sanders that long, then it takes him that long. I do think that eventually Sanders will put support behind Clinton, if for no other reason than the multiple times recently that he's hinted at joining the fight against Trump. He uses that word often, joining the fight against Trump. He's said it a few times, and he also has not, from what I gather, completely committed to basically staying a presidential candidate to the convention. Somebody asked him recently if he was going to be supporting or if he was going to be campaigning for issues or campaigning for the presidency at the convention, and he kind of dodged around that question a little bit. So with that being said, obviously, again, this is not a modeling thing, but I do think that there's a good chance that he puts some support behind Clinton. And if that does happen, the polls are going to be a really big thing to watch, because there's a number of disaffected Sanders supporters, just like there were in 2008 disaffected Clinton supporters.
And do you think it's going to matter if that happens before or after the convention? Is the timing critical?
I think that the timing is somewhat important. I think that it should happen before or during the convention in a similar way that Clinton did. If it happens after the convention, then it may give Republicans a bit of a foothold against Democrats for the election, knowing that Sanders is still holding out post-convention.
And Tyler, do you think the timing matters, whether it's before or after the convention, that Sanders throws his support?
I agree completely with Anthony. I think that if he waits until after the convention, then that'll give the Republicans a little bit more to go on.
Okay.
To sort of exploit the idea that the Democratic Party is divided.
Okay. So looking forward to the general election again, Tyler, what do you think is the critical demographic group? What if you were Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, who would you say this is who we need to target?
I think that Hillary probably as many people probably already know, she needs to do better with Bernie supporters, white Northerners.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, that's sort of Sanders' thing, right? And as we all know, Trump needs to focus a bit more on not upsetting minority groups.
Okay.
So I don't know if he even has a chance at this point to sort of reconcile his relationship with minorities, but he's going to have to try.
Okay, so do you think in the general, the two campaigns are going to be focusing on completely different demographics, or kind of are they going to be fighting for the same voters?
I think they'll be focusing on different demographics.
Okay.
For the reasons I just mentioned. I mean, Hillary already has the African American community is totally behind Hillary, right? And all minority groups seem to really dislike Trump. So yeah, they'll be fighting for two different things.
Okay. And Anthony, what are your thoughts?
I think that Tyler definitely makes some really great points, and I agree with him for the most part. I would like to add that one particular demographic group is, I think, especially important in this election cycle, especially if the race ends up becoming a bit closer than expected, and that would be Hispanics, and primarily Cuban Hispanics, but Hispanics as a whole. The reason I say that is because there are certain Hispanic groups that have been reliably Republican, and there are some Hispanic groups that have been reliably Democrat. But one of the areas of focus that I've been looking at very closely and seeing some interesting trends is Florida, especially in Miami-Dade County. So in Florida, there's a large number of Hispanic Republicans, but the thing about these Hispanic Republicans is that they often are willing to cross parties and vote for a Democratic Party candidate. We saw that in 2008 in Florida, and we've seen it in a few other years. The thing is that of all demographic groups that are in the Republican Party, the ones that are the most likely to go ahead and vote for the Democratic candidate are Hispanics, depending on what the issues are that are being spoken about. And in Florida, there was a recent poll of Miami-Dade County that showed something along the lines of 23% of Hispanic Republicans voting for saying that they'll vote for Hillary Clinton. If that occurs, then there would be almost no way that Donald Trump could win Florida. And without Florida, Donald Trump is going to have an enormous difficulty in winning the election. The maps right now that I'm looking at and the scenarios that I'm seeing really hinge on Trump being able to get the large electoral vote that Florida gives.
All right, thank you. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us, and Tyler, thank you for being with us today. Yeah. Hopefully we can do this again in the future, and thank you everybody else for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.